Mr. Ryan, where are you? There you are.
Here I am.
Lurking in the jungles. Welcome to the Horti-Culturalists. I'm Matthew Lucas.
And I'm Stephen Ryan.
And we do post every week, so hit subscribe and the notification bell if you want to know what we're up to every week. And Stephen, what are we up to this week?
This week we're going to discuss a couple of plants that fall into a category that generally puts fear into the heart of every home gardener.
Yes.
And that's the suckering thug.
Suckering thug. That sounds like a Guy Ritchie film.
Yeah, well, all I can say is we need to discuss this as a topic because it does tend to galvanise people into one camp or the other, so to speak.
All right, so I'm presuming we have suckering thug exhibits to go and examine.
We certainly do, and we'll go and do that right now.
Off we go then, suckering thugs, here we come. Okay, Stephen, is this suckering thug exhibit A?
This definitely is suckering thug
but
exhibit A.
Firstly, it's so beautiful.
It is exquisite. There's a point here that we need to make.
Yes.
If you're going to plant something in your garden that does sucker, and this certainly does, and quite strongly, you need to understand whether you can manage the plant or not, and whether it's worth the effort. Because, I mean, if it's a suckering thug and you get a week's flower out of it and the foliage is boring or whatever...
You're so brutal about some things.
Yeah, no, the plants have to pay their way. Now, we will mow the grass so that we've got a nice lawn, probably weekly when grass is growing at its most vigorous, and that's quite time consuming. So I don't see the fact that I've got a plant in the garden that I have to manage its sort of mogul hordes type attitude to life as such a bad thing. I mean, it's probably something I have to manage every 6 months or so to keep the plant in bounds, but it has to be worth it.
Well, that's one point. I guess the other point is, are there suckering thugs and suckering thugs? Are some things just going to go crazy and it's hard to rein back? Or is something like this sort of easier to manage in terms of how often do you have to control its thuggishness?
Well, certainly this particular plant, which we haven't even talked about the name yet, I might add.
Looks like a giant marijuana plant, just saying.
But that's for people who don't actually know what marijuana actually looks like.
Perhaps me. Anyway.
Yeah, yes, the naive and innocence of the world.
Bless.
It does have a leaf in the right shape, though, I have to say.
Okay, what is it? Tell us what it is.
All right, it's a Rubus. Rubus lineatus.
Is not Rubus raspberry?
Yes, raspberries, blackberries, boysenberries, all those plants all belong in the genus Rubus. And I might add the genus name itself is an old Latin name for probably something in this genus. So it doesn't mean anything specifically. It was known as Rubus.
Right.
Lineatus means lined or striped. And you can see why, because of the leaves. They have these wonderful pleated leaves.
They are beautiful. So can I ask then a basic question, as it's a raspberry, does it flower and have fruit?
Yes, but we're not growing it for that.
Okay.
So...
the parrots have descended upon it.
Yes, so here they go again. We are growing this thing strictly as an ornamental.
Yeah.
It can produce small white blackberry flowers, and it can also produce small edible raspberry-like fruit.
Yeah.
But if you're pruning it and managing it in the appropriate way, it's not going to get flowers and fruit.
Okay, so there are many things for us to cover. But firstly then, let's go back to the notion of a suckering thug. So in your opinion, what is a schedule that kind of is doable for a suckering thing?
If it's something that suckers shallowly under the ground,
that's
one thing.
Yeah.
If it doesn't,
is that a good thing?
That's a good thing, because if it's shallow, you can manage it more easily.
You can access it.
You can get it out. If it's suckering roots under the ground are not big and heavy and trunky like, so if it's something you can sever quite easily with a sharp spade, then the plant is probably manageable, and in most cases I will only have to manage this plant once or twice a year.
Which in the scheme of things, as you mentioned about lawns, is not such a big deal,
No,
is it?
It's not a big deal, and I think the plant well and truly pays for that little bit of extra attention. It's about its foliage, really. Its foliage is, I think, one of the prettiest leaves I have in the garden.
Yes.
It's got this wonderful, if we look at the reverse of the leaf, it's got this almost metallic, silvery effect underneath the leaf.
Yeah.
And it just grows like a very large clump of raspberries, which seems quite reasonable considering its relationship.
But it's very beautiful, and it's a very strong vertical, which is kind of similar to bamboo, I suppose.
Goodness, the cockatoos are going nuts.
So I guess in terms of management, not dissimilar to bamboos.
Well, but easier because they're not as hard to dig out. So I would put it in the same league as planting raspberries in the garden. You have to manage the raspberry suckers. They come up all over the place. This probably doesn't sucker as badly as the average raspberry, but you'll still plant those because you're desperate to have the fruit. So I'm still planting this because I'm desperate to have the foliage.
And I can say that I actually bought one from you as well to grow it in a pot because I just love the idea of it, and it's doing very well in pots. So it is something that takes well to pot culture,
it does.
which also contains the suckering.
Yeah. Now, there's one other management issue we need to discuss with this plant specifically.
Yeah.
You need to prune it. The way to prune it is to remove every winter all of the branched stems. So they're second-year stems.
Yeah.
So you take those out and you leave the strong vertical canes in.
Okay.
So if you look at the stems, you'll find that if you go down the stem, you'll find that they're sort of woodier. Brownish and woodier.
Yeah.
The younger ones are green and much more succulent looking, and you leave those.
And that's the same process as the raspberry that you grow for fruit. You cut the older canes and leave the greener ones to mature.
But in the case of this plant, by cutting the older canes, you are taking off any potential flowers and therefore potentially any fruit as well. So you're getting rid of the flower and fruit.
Question would be then, if you didn't prune it, is that a negative?
It's not going to hurt the plant.
Yeah.
What will happen though, the plant's foliage on the older stems will get smaller and therefore less impressive.
Literally shrink?
Well, no, the new leaves that come out get smaller and smaller on the branches.
I see.
Or on the twiggy branches.
Yeah.
I'll get it right in a minute. So the quality of the foliage is diminished by not pruning.
Right.
But you're not going to do that plant any harm. So if you miss doing it this year, it's not the end of the world.
Because I'm realising I haven't pruned mine that's in a pot from you.
Yeah. Well, this one will need pruning this coming winter.
Yep.
And I have to say, this is probably as tall as I've ever grown this plant. It's a good 3.5 metres tall, which is getting on towards the maximum size that I think it can grow anywhere. But we've had a really damp summer.
I was going to say, why is that? Well, that brings us to its condition. So it is from altitudes, isn't it?
Well, low altitudes, not right up in the mountains, but it comes from northern India through Thailand, Myanmar, into Laos and Vietnam.
Oh, quite a wide range.
Yeah, so it comes from quite a wide range of areas. I think it even goes down into the Malaysian peninsula. So it does go through quite a few tropical parts. It is a cool, temperate forest plant, though, nonetheless.
Yeah.
It will cope with quite cold conditions. It will then become somewhat deciduous in really cold climates. In our climate, it is strongly evergreen.
Right.
So there you go.
And do you think in Asia where it's native, is it grown for its fruit at all?
It is one of those hunter-gatherer fruits. I don't think they grow it for the market.
Commerce, yeah.
But if you happen to be out in the forest and the Rubus lineatus happens to be in flower
you'd
or
have
fruit,
a handful.
You'd have a little handful as you went past. And I might add that the Rubus genus gets a bad rap. I mean, you've got blackberries in there, so
which in Australia are a huge invasive problem.
Real problem. So, like a lot of plants that have some baddies within the genus, you tend to find the genus as a whole gets
spoil the barrel.
Yeah, they do rather. But of course, raspberries and boysenberries and other things like that, they do tend to make allowances for. Whereas there are other genera where there's weedy species and there's no edibility in the species, so then they all get cast asunder.
Yeah.
And
I recently read about a Rubus that has white stems, which is used in winter gardening. So
we will actually feature that in a winter posting that we will do later in the year.
Have you got the white-stemmed Rubus?
Of course.
Well, you'll have to watch this space for winter.
Yeah.
So is this everything we need to know about what looks like a giant marijuana plant that isn't?
The only thing I would say is, just in passing, because you know I love the trivia involved in lots of these things, is that the genus itself, the Rubus genus, is basically cosmopolitan, and at this stage...
Like the best of us.
Yes, and at this stage it consists of around about 1,400 named, accepted species and forms.
Wow.
So it is big.
And over every continent, do you think?
Pretty well. We have Australian native Rubuses.
Do we?
Oh Oh yes, we have several. We have a little tiny creeping one that grows in the mountains of Tasmania called Rubus gunnii, or gunnianus, I can't remember now, but anyhow, something like that.
What?
And we have another one called Rubus hallii, which is quite a bristly, prickly, nasty piece of work, but with rather nice foliage. So we have our own native raspberries and blackberries and things. And yes, you'll find them all through North America, all through Asia, all through Europe. There's hardly a part of the world where some native rubus don't grow, and of course the weedy ones have gone everywhere.
They have, as they have in this country too. So that is something to bear in mind about the invasive nature of some of these species in some environments.
Yes, having said that, I'm not sure that in most temperate climates this will become a serious weed, but it will be a management issue in gardens to keep it under control.
Excellent. Well, suckering thug 1, let's go on to suckering thug 2.
Why not indeed?
Lead on.
Here we go.
All right, Mr. Ryan, suckering thug number 2 is
a Rhus, R-H-U-S, Rhus glabra Laciniata, the cut-leafed Rhus.
What does glabra mean?
Smooth.
Smooth.
So it doesn't have furry leaves like the other species that's well known in the garden and is similar, which is Rhus typhina, the sumac. And it has slightly furry leaves. So
there we are.
That's the main difference. The flowers are different as well, but they're not, again, grown for flowers.
Quick observation, look at that sort of pinky raspberry stem. It's beautiful.
Yeah, this plant has great presence. Its cut ferny foliage makes it really beautiful overall in leaf.
Yeah.
The way the leaves sit on the stems is very elegant.
Yeah.
And yes, the sort of reddy pink coloured petioles, the leaf stems, are also beautiful. And of course, come autumn, the whole plant will turn brilliant shades of red before the foliage sheds.
Yeah.
So it makes a very good component to a border if you treat it like I do.
Okay, so let's just stop for a second. So in the scheme of suckering thugs, where does this sit in terms of, you mentioned about the shallowness of the roots or the depth, so where does this sit in that scheme of things?
It sits in that scheme reasonably well. Its underground stems are not overly thick, so they're reasonably easy to manage, and they're generally not terribly deep, although I think in a really sandy soil it might go a lot deeper. So management of the suckers isn't as bad, but in fact, unlike the Rubus, I actually encourage this to sucker more. So I want it to be a sucker drift in the garden. So I only remove suckers that have come up where I don't want them.
Right.
So that's the management that I do with it.
And do that once a year?
Once a year. What I do is, if you were to grow this and just grow it in the garden, it will eventually make a small tree. So it will get up quite tall. So what I do every winter is I go through and I cut all of the stems down level, so all of these branches come right down to ground level, and at the same time I dig up any suckers that have come up where I don't want them, because this plant has now worked its way right through my border,
which we'll show,
which is sort of what in the old measurements 40 or 50 feet long.
It's long.
It's probably at the widest point another 20 feet, and this plant has now managed to find its way throughout the whole border.
But that was your intent.
Exactly, because I wanted to use this plant as something that would tie the border together. And it looks stunning through the summer months with its lovely ferny bright green foliage. And in the autumn, when the whole border turns scarlet, it is quite spectacular.
It is. Now, there's a point, and I know you're not sort of a garden designer per se. It's for you, it's about the rarity and the unusualness of the plant. But there is the case for the eye kind of needs to see things. Repetition. Repetition is good for the eye, isn't it? So having the same thing spotted out the border is actually really restful to look at.
It is, and of course dramatic in the case of this plant when it colours in the autumn. But for me, I don't want, well, I've got a garden full of suckering thugs, actually, if I'm going to be perfectly honest, and they tie the garden together, but I don't have to plant more than one.
There you go.
So in a way, as long as I manage them, I'm actually getting that repetition, but I don't plant a whole heap of it.
Bang for buck, as they say in the trade.
Yes.
Now, does Rhus not have a bit of a bad rap?
Oh, yes. In North America, there is poison ivy, which is a Rhus.
Oh.
Nasty, nasty plant.
Okay.
Beautiful, but nasty plant. In Australia, we had an issue with one that was called Rhus succeediana, which was the Japanese wax tree, which gets waxy like berries on it, and it goes stunning colours in the autumn, makes a lovely little round dome tree. But certain people not me one of them, have an allergic reaction to it, and they can come out with some really debilitating rashes and nasty things happen. And so in Australia, Rhus has actually been put on a list of not to grow at nurseries, not to plant in gardens, etc. I mean, I grew it years ago when I was a youngster in the old family nursery. We never had a problem with it. I have an auntie who swears black and blue she only has to walk within 20 metres of one, and
she comes out in welts.
Yes, she comes out in welts.
Ooh.
Now, I'm not quite sure that's true, because I would have believed only that it was a matter of coming in contact with most plants. But anyhow, but Rhus in one sense is quite good because it's now no longer a Rhus. So it's been taken out of the genus. It's now in its own, called rather appropriately Toxicodendron Cecidiana.
That sounds like a very Britney Spears kind of
plant. It is. But
yes,
because of the Rhus and because of the poison ivy in North America, the genus as a whole gets something of a bad rap.
Wow, not dissimilar to raspberries. Now, did we mention the full name of this?
Yes, this one is, yes, Rhus glabra Laciniata, so the cut-leafed form of Rhus glabra.
And where is it from? Where's its native range?
Well, the straight form of it, the cut-leaf form, arose in cultivation, of course. So the wild form of it is North American, as is typhina, and in fact, one of the Rhus species, you actually get the culinary herb sumac from. Rhus typhina, which gets sort of red cone-like flowers on it, you can actually soak the cones in water and it will make a pink, thirst-quenching, acidy drink. So you don't need to be frightened of these for any allergic reason. You only need to be a little cautious of them because of their suckering habit, basically.
There you go. So, given you cut it down and it's North American, what is its hardiness? What are its ideal conditions?
All right. It's not going to grow well in the tropics.
No.
But it will grow in most Mediterranean climates through to cold climates. You'll see it in fairly northern parts of North America. It certainly grows perfectly hardily in any part of Britain. I would imagine most of continental Europe. Maybe it might be a struggle up in Scandinavia. I don't know. But certainly it will grow in most temperate or Mediterranean to cold climates. I just wouldn't attempt to grow this in the tropics because I don't think it would like it. So you can't grow it if you're in Florida.
And your border here is in full sun?
Full sun. The autumn colour is always better with these sorts of plants if they're actually getting the sun directly on them. So this border actually has a sort of north-south sort of directional. The east-west comes up over the border in every part of it. So the whole border gets plenty of water, plenty of sunlight, and these things just go nuts.
And so I guess it's important to just stress again, you have to cut it every year if you just want it to be in a perennial border. Otherwise it's going to be a suckering tree.
Yeah, it will. It'll become a small suckering tree, so you'd end up with a thicket of trees. You could end up with your own copse.
There we go. Yeah. Well, copse it ain't.
No, not here it isn't. So I stretch the boundaries of perennial borderism by planting this here, but I treat it as a perennial.
There we go. So well, I think we have done suckering thugs.
Well, at least some of them. Well, there we go, Matthew. There's a couple of suckering thugs for you if there ever was some. But I reckon we'll be doing it more often than you believe.
Indeed. Well, that was fabulous. Naughty Rhus and Naughty Rubus.
Yes, and there will be other naughties as well. It'll be like the Star Wars franchise. There will be many, many episodes.
So, just to reiterate, what do you think the key things to consider about a plant that does have a suckering habit?
All right. Well, the key things to consider, one is can you manage it?
Yes.
And you need to know its habit, so how deep it goes, how strong the roots are,
yes,
all that sort of thing, and how vigorously it suckers. Of course.
Yes. So these things that we've spoken about, you only really manage them once or twice a year?
At the most. Most of my thugs get handled once a year.
No one likes a high maintenance thug, just saying.
But there are some that I grow in the garden that I don't really do anything to. I mean, they fill a gap, they do their thing, they grow in an aspect where other plants are difficult to grow, and so I just want them to fill it up. So, so some of them I don't actually manage much at all.
And we have covered sort of similar things in bamboos. I mean, we made a video about bamboos, and some of those, obviously the running bamboos, have those same habits and require thought about maintenance and upkeep.
And aspect.
Yes.
Against the neighbour's fence is always a bad place to plant a suckering thug.
Well, I think we've all benefited from your Suckering Thug 101, the Guy Ritchie film. Can't wait for the sequel. Well, talking of sequels, what could we do next week?
Well, let's talk about something that doesn't sucker, perhaps,
something
just for a change.
Pretty and charming.
Yes.
Okay, well, for you to know what that might be, you'll have to hit the subscribe button and notification bell if you want to know exactly what that might be. True. And we look forward to seeing you next week.
Yeah, so goodbye all.
See you later.